throw an audible here in a second. Call an audible. Um, Two announcements real quick before we jump into the sermon. So the first is that at the end of this service, we're going to have another announcement. I'm announcing an announcement. But Arthur McLaughlin is going to share with us about his annual Halloween fundraiser. And this year he has chosen to have it benefit Hope, which is really cool. So we're excited about that, and he's going to share with us about that. You may have also noticed there's a QR code on the bulletin. That's to direct you to that. But you'll hear more about that from Arthur. The second thing is that this past week, on Monday, a team of us from this congregation are going to be going through a year-long cohort called Thriving Congregations. And Thriving Congregations is it's a program put together through a grant that was received by the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship. There's 4 or 5 churches in the North Carolina, Virginia area. They're one cohort, and then there's 4 or 5 churches in the Florida region, in Florida. Florida's so cool, we get our own region. Actually, we're also regioned with the Caribbean, but anyway, it's Florida churches, right? So there's 4 or 5 of us that are going to move together as a cohort through this yearly program called Thriving Congregations. And the idea behind Thriving Congregations is that congregations can thrive. See why they named it that? But what is a thriving congregation, right? Well, a congregation that would be thriving would be one that exhibited these 5 traits. Compelling clarity, right? Kind of the ability to see what the needs of our community are. Holy tenacity, the strength to pursue addressing those needs. Faithful agility, being able to respond in time, right, to the varying changes of our culture, our communities, our own congregations. Rooted relationships, I think we understand that one. And dynamic collaboration, being able to play well with others. So, it is these 5 traits that a team from your church, your friends, are going to be pursuing. Yes, and that team is myself. They required the pastor to be a part of it. That was part of the grant rules. So, myself and Caleb Kravitz and Michael Odell and Jerry Odell and Lois Lane and Jake Galster. And yeah, so what I want you to do is I want you to do a couple things. Keep in mind that this group is committed to the church that we're all a part of being healthy and strong. And the end of this, the idea behind this year-long cohort is that through it, you come up with what they call a holy experiment. Right? Something that you create for your congregation that is meant to push its life along. It could be anything, right? It can literally be anything. The other churches that have gone through the program have had all kinds of various things that they have launched or created or addressed within their congregation through this holy experiment. So I want you to be keeping in mind that there's a group of people that is working for you, that is willing to think deeply and do the work of meeting together and listening to lectures and reading articles, all for the sake of the congregation that you're a part of, meeting your needs and the needs of our broader community is the main issue, right? And then I also want you to be mindful of that holy experiment and to really think to yourself through your days and weeks, what is it that our church could be a part of that maybe it isn't? Or what is it that our church could be doing that maybe it hasn't or doesn't, that seems to fit with its culture, whatever. And if you have ideas, throw them to us, right? We want to hear, we want to be, of course, tapped into the desires and needs and thoughts of the congregation to have that clarity piece of the puzzle. So also, of course, lastly, keep us in your imaginations, your creative Godward thoughts, your prayers, however it is that you say it, that part of yourself that calls out of its place of desire. Focus that towards us, please, so that we have strength and creativity through this process. Okay, over the last few weeks, we've seen from the lectionary text a call to be building up a new world, through the building up of the community of faith. Perfect timing, right? We've seen that our faith is one that leads us to examine, to ask about, to challenge, if need be, the material conditions of our world. We saw that our bodies are important and holy, and they are sacred offerings that are used in the building up of the larger body of Christ. And we saw that that body, the body of Christ, has the role of reconciling, of bringing bodies once estranged from each other into right relationship with each other. And we saw our task of being a warning call to the world, right? Sentinels from the life of Ezekiel. A warning call to the world whose systems are built on the exploitation of these bodies, calling out the destruction that awaits if we continue to view this material world as nothing more than a means through which we can build wealth and power. We saw that these communities of the new humanity, communities Paul calls the name ecclesia, a word that brings to mind our mission of standing for, on behalf of the good of others. We saw these churches are the means through which we critique the injustice of our world and the way we administer healing to those who have been hurt. As we mentioned briefly last week, we must take care then to ensure that the life of these communities, lest they be co-opted by the forces of the pursuit of wealth and power, lest they be torn apart by infighting, bitterness, and strife, we must ensure that these lives of our communities are protected and fostered and grown. We are reminded of the words of Paul that we only do that which is for the purpose of building each other up. Right? It kind of seems obvious, but don't take any actions that tear each other down. Only do the things that are good for building each other up. So today we'll look at one of the tools of community building, a tool that we use to craft and tend to this body of Christ. You know, the metaphors in the New Testament, there are metaphors in the New Testament such as crafting and tending and building, right? We see the church talked about as a temple built brick by brick. We also see it called a garden, growing and bringing life and beauty to the world. And all of these metaphors for us, whether it's garden or building or crafting, right? They evoke a sense of work, and they evoke the sense of needing tools, right? Whether it's gardening or building, you have to use tools. You can't, I guess you don't have to. You could use your hands, but it would take immensely longer, right, to plow a field with your bare hands. We use tools. That's the human thing. And the right tool for the right job makes all the difference in the world. Using the wrong tools can lead us off course, obviously. It can lead to broken IKEA shelves. It can lead to gates off of hinges. It can lead to all sorts of things. Talking about something a friend of mine did, I don't know. And it can lead us off course in our kingdom work. So before we get into what this tool today is, let's talk a little bit about some of the tools that are at our disposal and given to us by our culture that maybe aren't the right ones for the job of community building. As we talked about a little bit last week, our world tends to be structured in a way that sees individuals, right, you, me, other like individual bodies, as pieces or cogs, right, elements of a machine of economic production. And even though we have all these culturally significant moments, movies and books and television and, right, all kinds of like little significant things in our culture that say, there's more to life than making money. We don't really believe it, like deep down. Think about some of the idioms that are in play in our language. We speak of people becoming productive members of society. Right? In order to be a good part of society, a valued member of our shared life together, you need to be producing. Producing what? Goods, services, right? Contributing to the economy. We produce and we consume. That's what being a human in our culture really comes down to. Producing and consuming. Right? And if you disagree that these are the foundational postures of our culture, think about it this way. If you aren't doing one of those, either producing or consuming, it's pretty clear that people tend to look at you like something's wrong. Right? If you don't consume, you're weird at the very least, like odd. And certainly if you don't produce. Even though unemployment is a necessary and integral feature of our economy, right, which is why the Fed has to increase it from time to time, even though it's part and parcel of the way we've set up our economy, there is shame imposed and felt by individuals who don't have a job. What if you aren't producing or consuming? What if you're doing neither? Odds are you're labeled something like schizophrenic, right? Extremely mentally ill, and you probably can't really live in society. If you're doing neither, you probably have to be institutionalized or homeless. Most of what goes under the name of the treatment of mental illness is to create the end goal of a patient being able to more effectively function as a good producer and consumer. Now, for people who have lacked the freedom of movement and the leisure time and rest and security afforded by having a place to dwell safely, getting a job and a home can be a real and true victory, right? I'm not trying to take that away or downplay the accomplishments of someone who worked hard to secure for themselves something. That's great. But can we really say that being a human being in our culture amounts to much more than that? And can't we all agree that according to the biblical text, it does or should amount to much more than that? That we are more than that. There are tools in play to help this way of seeing the world run smoothly that we are given. In case you haven't noticed, tons of people are unhappy. Feel disjointed, alienated, lonely, confused. Suicide rates among young people are rising. Why? Well, some people tell us because people aren't resilient anymore. People let their circumstances determine their reactions, when really we all have control over our own responses. People work these jobs they don't like, but they don't like them because they don't have a why. Right? They need a purpose. People need to find a purpose for their cyclical, banal lives. And so we have book after book after book after podcast after public pseudo-philosopher after blog post on self-improvement, calls to work on ourselves. I Googled it, so I don't know how accurate the number is, but some people value the self-improvement industry at $13 billion annually. It's a huge market, right? I mean, it's no cell phones, but you should see, though, the apps every year. There are more and more self-help apps that charge more and more money. Self-help, with all of its appropriated practices and guru-like leaders, is really the perfect religious expression for a capitalist society. Because not only does it, by and large, ignore our material conditions as unimportant factors, it also allows for endless producing and consuming, more content to buy, more content to make. But Christianity is not about making things better for ourselves internally while the world just burns. It's about putting out the fires. There are spiritual practices in the Bible. Individual actions of spiritual discipline are hugely important. Jesus often went to pray alone. Paul claims that he had reached a point where he could say, with all honesty, I'm content with any circumstance. But why? Because he counted any possession or lack thereof as less important than his mission of creating communities of faith around the way of Jesus. There's no way that somebody could read Paul and Jesus, and certainly not the prophets, and think that the goal is some kind of personalized, atomized happiness. Paul is constantly challenging the status quo of the world around him, and certainly Jesus does the same, not simply calling people into a path of their own enlightenment, but pointing out the flawed patterns of systems around him and calling on leadership to change their ways. It would be absurd to imagine Jesus or Paul looking around their world or at our world, seeing the injustice around them and thinking, hey, I can't control what's going on. I can only control my mindset. I can only adjust how I think about it. No, people are unhappy because we live in an unhappy world. People feel isolated and alienated because we live in a world that isolates and alienates us. So while Christianity claims to speak truth into these realities, it does so not just by addressing the individual, but by addressing the individual as a part of a body. That is why we see such a huge importance in the New Testament on the church. And why Paul really isn't out of line to call the church a new humanity. A wholly other way of expressing our human subjectivity. So if the tools of our trade are not just those used to simply bolster the status quo by keeping us docile and happy, then what are they? Well, they're varied, of course, but the one that arises from our lectionary's text today is the tool of forgiveness. In the text you heard read, we hear a question from Peter to Jesus. How many times should I forgive someone in the community who harms me? Remember last week we saw the idea of directly addressing a community member if they hurt you or harm you. I think based on all that we see from Jesus, what is in mind in these passages is some kind of act of defrauding, right? Maybe taking advantage of someone economically. A system like the one Jesus spells out and talks about constantly, about eventually going before, mixing up things here. The structure Jesus gives us of eventually going before the whole community, if you have a problem with one person, right, would have real potential to protect the interests of someone who's weaker, who doesn't own land, who didn't have the authority in the broader community of, right, maybe someone who harmed them that was more powerful. Some of us were talking about this last week after the service, so I wanted to make sure we addressed it. Last week, how Matthew 18 has been used to kick people out of churches, out of community, for breaking the communal moral codes of that community that have little or nothing to do with life in God's kingdom. And the humiliation that arises from those kinds of experiences is huge, right? It's terrible. Excommunicating someone for, say, like drinking alcohol doesn't fall under good examples of Matthew 18, right? That falls more under our text from Romans 14. Why do you pass judgment on your brother or sister? Or you, why do you despise your brother or sister? No, Matthew 18 is about the need to find ways of resolving real threats to the undoing of community, to the life of community. The typical excommunication story that you've heard probably needs to be flipped, right? Because in reality, it is those who stand in judgment over others from the position of their own particular moral authority who tear apart the community. So, after dealing with this mechanism of working through destructive actions, whose goal is the restoration of relationship, if you notice, Peter asks, well, how many times are we supposed to forgive those who harm us? And after Jesus gives his answer 77 times, he launches into this story. And the gist is, as you heard, that a servant, a slave in a household borrowed from the householder, couldn't pay him back. But rather than trying to recoup that money by selling the servant and his family to another household, he forgives the debt, just releases it, cancels it. Doesn't give him more time, right? It's very clear. He cancels the debt. Well, then he goes, this slave, and he demands a much smaller debt from another servant in the household. And then the householder revokes the forgiveness and throws him in debtor's prison. Now, what's so great about this story is that Jesus speaks of forgiveness by placing it in terms of economy. Peter asks about being sinned against, and we don't know what he had in mind. How often do I forgive a brother or sister who sins against me? Maybe he's thinking of someone not returning him money. Maybe he's thinking of someone who charges him too much interest when the fish aren't biting or getting caught in nets. Right? Maybe that's the main point of all this. If you read and study the teachings of Jesus in the Gospels, it is economic relationships that are behind much of what is called sin. Most of the stories, Almost all of the parables Jesus tells give shape and words to the experience of the peasant class. So it is likely that Peter has something about indebtedness in mind here. Right? Think about even the Lord's Prayer. One says, forgive our trespasses. The other says, forgive us our debts. Those aren't so disparate, right? They interlock with each other. But even if Peter is not thinking specifically in those terms, speaking of forgiveness in these economic terms, as Jesus does, is really helpful for us because it points us to the ways that we hold others in debt. It shows us that the release of this debt over others is the goal of forgiveness. Right? Sometimes forgiveness, which I would argue is a central theme of Christianity, I think we all agree on that, gets twisted to accomplish some pretty grotesque things, doesn't it? Forgiveness is not an excuse or a cover-up for abuse or oppression. We've probably all seen forgiveness used this way. The woman in an abusive relationship told to stay with her husband and forgive him as Jesus would have us do, only to continue to be abused. We sometimes see forgiveness being invoked against justice, right? Sometimes people imagine that those who seek to bring a good world about need to be docile and sweet all the time. Those in power, I don't know if you've noticed this, often have very thin skin. And any little tiny indication that they could possibly do their job better is met with pushback. And so those who seek to hold leaders accountable are sometimes called belligerent or pushy or whatever else, and they need to have a more forgiving attitude. But let's keep in mind the text from last week where Jesus said, if someone hurts you, go to them. And if they won't listen, go with 2 or 3 more. And if they won't listen, bring it before the community. And if they still won't listen, let them be to you like an outsider. The connection is severed. Right? Too often we want to get to the forgiveness part without ever getting through the you hurt us part. As we said, it would be completely outside of the path, life, teachings of Jesus to think that a weaker person or a weaker group would continue to be dominated, exploited, or abused because of invoking forgiveness. No, what Jesus is referring to here is the way that we can hold on to something against another that has already been resolved. This servant in the story has no reason to so aggressively pursue his debt against his fellow servant. Right? The forgiveness of his massive debt to the landholder clears up the need to exact it from another, right? The only reason you collect the lower debts is because you got to pay the ones that are up above you. But with that erased, there's no reason other than greed to collect from his fellow servant. The householder is saying, I've created the conditions for you to be free from all of this indebtedness. The fact that you're still choosing to live within it is just evil. The flow of the story thus show us something about forgiveness. Lack of forgiveness on our part means that we are still enslaved. And it works from all directions, which is why this is such a communal story. If we ourselves have things held over our heads by others, if we are unforgiven, then we will be unforgiving, seeking to enact the mental anguish on others that someone has exacted from us. This is why an act of forgiveness on your part or my part can have so much power in releasing someone from the supposed emotional debt they owe to you. They can then be free to release others. Your forgiveness of one person really could be the forgiveness of like 40 other people, right? It's like an MLM. You have a front line, you've forgiven 5 people, and they forgive their 5 people, and they forgive their 5 people. And before you know it, will all be free, right? The reverse can be true as well, which is extremely frightening. When Jesus answers Peter about how many times he should forgive someone, there's debate over what he says, right? Is it 70 times 7, 490, or is it 77? And I don't think it really matters because Jesus isn't giving a cutoff, right? Oh, I really hope it's 77 so I can stop forgiving after that, right? No, it's more of like a hyperbolic, like never, Peter, sorry, But I like 77 because it reminds us then of another time we hear this contrast between 77 and 7. It brings our minds to the ancient story in Genesis chapter 4, where we hear the genealogy of Cain's descendants. And in one of his descendants, we see a man named Lamech. And Lamech has this song that he sings to his 2 wives. He says, I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for striking me. If Cain is avenged 7 times, Lamech will be avenged 77 times. Right? This is the kind of founding story that is told, that we see unfold through the rest of Genesis and Exodus, right? This is how great empires are built. Kill one of mine, we'll kill all of yours. Harm me slightly, I'll destroy you fully. But in Jesus, we see this reversed with the same use of 7 and 77, right? Just as violence and alienation and bitterness can exponentially grow, leading to death and destruction, so forgiveness can exponentially grow, leading to life and the building up of community. That's why forgiveness is so central. It is explicitly communal. It naturally brings a group of people together as they know they are loved and who love others. So our call then is to pick up and learn to use the tool of forgiveness. Have you ever seen someone who, has never used a drill before? I've been trying to get my sons to start using, tools, right? And it's just funny, they do a pretty good job with it. But where you can just tell someone hasn't done it. Even though they might have put the screw in the wall, just the way they're holding it's a little unnatural or something, right? This is how it is when we first learn to use tools that we haven't gotten really good at yet. That's what it's going to feel like as you start to exercise forgiveness. It's going to feel awkward and weird, and maybe you probably won't even do it right, and you'll probably put an extra hole in the wall or something. That's okay. It takes work. It takes practice. Let's hold close to our hearts that forgiveness is an exercise, a discipline in community and connection. Sometimes you'll hear it talked about. It's funny because we open with the self-help thing. Sometimes you'll hear it talked about in broader self-help thinking that it doesn't matter for the forgiven individual that you forgive them. It just is a way to free yourself, right? And it is true, as we saw, that releasing someone from their debt to you frees you from a burden. But forgiveness has now become a part of the quest for personal happiness in our culture. And you can see this version of it everywhere, right? But we can't forget the other part of it. Forgiveness does free the forgiven. And our responsibility isn't just to ourselves. Forgiveness is a step in personal happiness, sure, but it is for the people around us. It is for those who are forgiven. Secondly, we have to live within our own forgiveness. Has someone released you from the harm that you've done them? Then let it go. Right? Move on. Too often we hold on to our imaginations that we are still in debt to someone else when that might not be the case. And the result? We act like the servant, going around trying to collect from others, lashing out, being angry. Maybe it's not the anger side. Maybe it's being too clingy, too worried about what people think. Maybe you don't have any particular example that comes to mind of a relationship where you aren't embracing your own forgiveness, but maybe you just kind of generally feel indebted to everybody, right? I think that's probably more common. Maybe you just kind of generally feel unforgiven. But as we heard last week, don't consider yourself as owing anyone anything other than love. Think about this. What if we just rest, right, in the idea that we are just fine in our community because we have enough trust in each other that if we're not, it'll come out. Right? Why don't you just move through life? This is my challenge. Move through life as if you're just fine in your relationships with other people, trusting that they'll come to you if they have a problem. Isn't that what we're told to do? If they're not doing that, that's their problem, not yours. There are times, of course, when people need to address others more directly, like we talked about last week, and maybe that needs to happen in your life. But my point, too, is that a lot of times we have not embraced any kind of forgiveness for ourselves, and so we walk around imagining who might be mad at us about what thing, who has a problem with me that I'm not aware of, when it's probably not even the case at all. And last, of course, consider who it is that you are holding in debt in your heart and mind, that therefore you have lost connection with. Maybe it means confronting them. Look, I feel like you've harmed me. Those aren't easy conversations, right? Because of the complexity of human relationships, it's likely that if you go up to someone and say, I feel like you've harmed me, you're going to get this in return. Yeah, I feel like you've harmed me too. And you might argue about it, and you might fight about it. There's going to be back and forth. But those times will lead us back to connection when we let love guide us through them, right? Not just the idea of trying to destroy our opponent. And in doing that and moving through those kinds of moments, our community can grow strong, and we will be able to meet the needs of the world around us, right? Otherwise, we won't, because we'll just be too focused on our own feelings of ineptitude or whatever. And we won't move on to our call to justice. But if we can do this, then we will be a place of beauty and healing, connection, and we will see the new humanity flourish, and we will find joy and depth together. This is the good news for us. Let's embrace it together. Let's walk into the way of forgiveness as a community. Let's pray. God, we ask that you give us courage and free us from the false idea that